One of the most intriguing locations in Final Fantasy VIII's world is the remote settlement of Fisherman's Horizon. With its unique, eco-friendly, diesel punk design, soothing soundtrack, and determinately isolationist citizens, it stands as a reprieve and outpost in a world otherwise torn between belligerent superpowers. And yet, despite this, or perhaps indeed because of this, Fisherman's Horizon features one of the more memorable plot points in Final Fantasy VIII, where the remote harmony of the place and its pacifistic outlook is challenged by the invading, uncompromising might of the Galbadian military, and its stubbornly non-violent leader, Mayor Dobe, is confronted with the imminent demise of both himself and his people. So, why is this moment in FF8 so memorable? How do we feel about the actions or inactions of Mayor Dobe, and what does it tell us about the plight of reason in an inherently unreasonable world? Jumping right in, it's firstly interesting to take a step back and consider the lore and backstory behind the existence of Fisherman's Horizon, which we can only really uncover if we do the Master Fisherman side quest after arriving at FH, and also speaking with Mayor Dobe outside of the central plotline. Because Fisherman's Horizon is a settlement founded entirely on the principles of non-conformist pacifism and a willful escape from the volatile superpowers of the wider world. Indeed, the founders of the settlement, led by Master Fisherman, and including those like Mayor Dobe, are expatriated engineers from the high-tech city of Esthar that, reading between the lines and looking at the chronology of the game, would likely have left during the volatile reign of Sorceress Egill and the heated relations going on between Esthar, Galbadia, and Trabia during that time. So where Esthar is known for its abundant technology, Galbadia known for its rich history and military, Fisherman's Horizon is decidedly sparse by comparison, comprised almost entirely of ascetic ironwork and powered by renewable energies like wind and solar. And these factors, along with its remoteness in the middle of the ocean, are entirely by design, because while it's not much to look at, there's also not much to plunder either. There's no natural resources or riches, and there's not much any expansionist superpower would find of value in a settlement such as this. Indeed, Mayor Dobe's name in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VIII lends a little bit more to this idea, because while the title of Mayor makes it seem like he's in charge of some sort of developed society that trades and that sort of thing, his Japanese title is Station Master, and that is much more fitting with what FH seeks to be in this world. It's a simple, inoffensive way station along the Horizon Bridge. Nothing to see, nothing to do, and certainly no reason to invade, which suits these pacifistic denizens right down to the ground. Turning to the events of Final Fantasy VIII with this context in mind, the unobtrusiveness of FH and the isolationist principles of Dobe are challenged firstly when Balam Garden crash lands into the settlement, forcing him to engage with outsiders, but more significantly when the Galbadian military arrives in search of a loan and, irrespective of achieving this goal, are intent on burning the settlement to the ground once they leave anyway. Now, irrespective of one's stance on pacifism, the principle as embodied by Mayor Dobe is not a particularly endearing one. Indeed, unlike famous advocates of non-violent resistance in the real world, like Mahatma Gandhi, Mayor Dobe does not seek to encourage or spread this virtue among the people he encounters, but rather he belligerently wants outsiders to leave them well alone, particularly the Seed mercenaries, who, by their very nature, trade in violence. So he's a very obstructionist, isolationist sort of guy that, for most players of Final Fantasy VIII, isn't someone that we particularly warm to. Now, when Galbadia arrives on the scene, there is a tragi-comic moment where we learn that Mayor Dobe has gone to give them a good talking to which Squall exclaims quite simply that he's dead. And indeed, were it not for the active intervention of Seed and the sheer happenstance that they were there, this would have been the case. And so FH and Mayor Dobe become part of a plot point that always stuck with me in how it questions where the limits of pacifism are, where the limits of reason are, in an unjust world. Exploring this a little bit further, many might, as rational human beings, sit on the side of Mayor Dobe in principle. Human beings desire safety, harmony, we have a hierarchy of needs that is dependent on peace, and almost always gets disrupted by conflict. Yet, what this scenario presents in FF8 is the limits of non-violent absolutism, a disinterested isolationism that is inherent to Mayor Dobe's worldview. Looking at how this has been debated over time, and at the fringes of philosophical thought, prominent thinkers have long suggested that pacifism is tantamount to a complicity in evil. In the throes of the Second World War, George Orwell wrote that pacifism is objectively pro-fascist, as inaction on one side automatically helps the other. Similar in sentiment and time period, we have the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who preached that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. And dating back through history, thinkers like John Stuart Mill, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and ideas around the social contract have suggested that inaction can only lead to oppression, and institutions of law, order, military, and so on are necessary not to restrict civic freedom, but rather prevent tyranny from invading it. Turning to pacifism, and particularly the sort that we see embodied by Mayor Dobe, it's something that we find rooted largely, but not exclusively, in certain religions, like Buddhism, that advocate non-violence as a moral virtue, and indeed perhaps one of the highest moral virtues. Is very famously embodied, for example, by the life of Jesus Christ, whose non-violence right up into the act of his own execution sought to epitomise the moral absoluteness of pacifism, forgiveness, and so on. And this is where the rub comes, because when idealism and utopianism encounters the realities of imperialism, fascism, total war, and so on, cracks begin to emerge. It's no coincidence that the Christian faith declined rapidly in the wake of the horrors of World War I, giving rise to existential thinkers, and how later Christians, like the aforementioned Bonhoeffer, moulded their faith around defence as a moral obligation rather than a resignation to non-violence and non-intervention. Indeed, Bonhoeffer, while never actively taking up arms himself, preached that Christians should not retreat from the world, but rather be active observers and participants in it, and he was himself deeply involved with resistance movements in World War II, eventually being executed for his involvement in an assassination attempt on the Führer. So, looping back to Mayor Dobe and the status of FH in Final Fantasy VIII, it's an interesting case study of moral non-resistance versus defence as a moral obligation. His refusal not only to fight or have a standing security force, but his refusal to even engage with more measured players on the global stage, like Sid Kramer's Seed, and specifically in his interactions with Squall Leonhart, shows us how isolationism and geopolitical disinterest can, on a long enough timeline, catch up. And while the selflessness of self-sacrifice might be considered noble by many, the ultimate futility of inaction, and in this case, Mayor Dobe sacrificing an entire populace by his inaction, and his refusal to even engage or foster allies like Seed from further afield, makes a really interesting, if short-lived, argument about where moral necessities for defence versus pacifism begins and ends. And while perhaps not consciously aware of why, I think it makes this scenario something that many players of Final Fantasy VIII tend to remember to this day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.